The Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2025. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Mfume, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority. You are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't suspect I'm going to use the entire amount of time that's been allotted, but I would ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material on the subject of my special order today.
Recognized. Thank you. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about 2 things. One, particularly of import and interest, because we're exiting what we have come to know in this country as Black History Month, and the other, more pertinent in terms of the current news and what's going on, particularly what's been going on over the last month and a half. But I want to talk today, to begin my remarks, talking about this whole notion of history, why it is important, why nobody owns it, why it affects all of us as Americans, and why it's important to remember, because in remembering we tend not to make the same mistake again. And so as we end the month, tomorrow officially, I wanted to take some time today to bring to the attention of the American public something that is not highlighted and very seldom ever talked about, but very, very important because it was a grave injustice and a mark on our nation's history, referred to as the Tulsa Race Massacre, which occurred in the summer of 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to begin by trying to walk us back to that summer, those 3 nights when the affluent Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, often referred to then and now as Black Wall Street, was burned to the ground, totally burned to the ground. And 300 African American people, men, women, and children, were murdered. 300. It's hard to imagine that that happened in this country in just the last century, just a little over 100 years ago, but it did. And the fact that it did, I think, speaks volumes about why it is so very important that we understand the deep hurt that took place, and why we understand also it's really our responsibility to remember that and to make sure that we don't allow this nation to creep down that dark kind of a road again. And so that Tulsa Race Massacre, again, 300 people murdered. It started with a young man being falsely accused of sexual assault, a 19-year-old kid, when on May 30th, 1921, Sarah Page, who was a young white woman operating an elevator in the Drexel building in Tulsa, Oklahoma, encountered him, he encountered her. Dick Rowland was the name of the 19-year-old black kid. He was a shoe shiner, a delivery boy, and worked in the Drexel building. And he was in that building at that time because they had a public, quote, colored restroom facility. And so he came there to relieve himself as he normally did. But while there, both Rowland and Page were both in an elevator, and a clerk, ironically, a white clerk, claimed to have heard a scream and called the police, telling them that this kid, this 19-year-old kid, Rowland, had sexually assaulted the young lady. The police chief, whose name was John Gustafson, reported that the young lady bore no scratches, no bruises, no disarranged dress, and the young woman said, no, he never made a bad remark to me of any kind. This is a public record. So you would think that that would be enough to really negate this false claim that someone just yelled out of the clear blue. But despite that, Charges were brought against the 19-year-old kid, Mr. Rowland. He was arrested and then taken to the Tulsa courthouse. And then later that afternoon, newspapers ran inflammatory articles hot off the press that suggested that the 19-year-old kid, Rowland, had sexually assaulted the young lady, and they ran with a story that stirred emotions at that time. And the story was, headline, read all about it, young Negro nabbed for attacking girl in elevator. Even though the girl's testimony was, he never touched me, we never spoke, he got on the elevator, he got off, and even though there was no physical evidence to the contrary, that's what the newspaper ran at the time. And that worried, as most of the residents were, that this kid was going to be lynched. Approximately 300 men met at the courthouse, and an estimated 25 black men also arrived at the scene to back up the sheriff, who had sent out a plea for help. The sheriff wanted somebody there to protect the courthouse, to ensure justice, and to make sure that this kid he had to take into custody was in fact safe. However, when the crowd of white men swelled to roughly 3,000, and the group of black men swelled to about 75, confrontation did not take place. There was a standoff at the courthouse, and the National Guard Armory in Tulsa opened its doors and allowed people to come in, citizens, to arm themselves. They just took whatever weapons they wanted, and then they dispersed. Now, if this sounds a little strange, it really, really is. This was 104 or so years ago, and it's the sort of thing that in this month where we talk about Black history and American history, which are both intertwined, it's important to say to a lot of people, this really happened. I'm not making it up. We've got court records, there are newspaper records, there's reports of all sorts of type by those who reported the news. This is an American fact. It's chilling. I mean, it is sad. It is very, very sad. And I don't raise it today to make anybody feel bad. I just raise it to say that you can't simply close the books and act like things did not happen, call it DEI if somebody wants to talk about it, and pretend that something that did happen that was gross and so anti-human that it just is still repulsive to pretend that it did not happen. So for someone just tuning in right now, these are the statistics from that day. Again, this community, Greenwood, was known as the Black Wall Street at the time. It was thriving with businesses and entrepreneurship and commerce. 85 of the businesses in that town owned by the black population were burned to the ground. 1,000 of their homes were set on fire and burned to the ground. As I indicated in my opening remarks, 300 African Americans were killed that day and the next day, and that there were 700 people injured, overflowing the hospitals that in that day and time were challenged anyway. So the total damage was estimated to be 1.5 million, but in today's dollars, it's 32 million plus. So what was left of the town? Just smoldering ashes. And again, it's important to talk about this because this actually happened. And for anybody thinking that Black History Month is just a celebration of all the great things that African Americans did or invented or their role in the arts or in sports or anything like that, it is. But it's also about the shame of massacres in this country, the home of the free and the land of the brave, and how somehow we're supposed to just cover it over and never believe that it happened. There's importance in remembering, and the importance is to remember so that it never happens again. So, as I indicated, there's this standoff. The sheriff has called for help. He believes that this mob of 300 white men are going to storm the small jail, are going to take the 19-year-old kid and lynch him. The National Guard, for some reason, opened its doors so that citizens can run in and get weapons and arm themselves. We don't know who fired the first shot or what happened, but we do know that what was to happen would be the worst race massacre in American history. Gunfire broke out between the Greenwood men and the white mob, and at least 20 persons fell dead right there at that first volley. During the shootout, this is published reports, this is not hearsay. During the shootout, white mobs prevented the ambulances from treating wounded black men and let them lay there and die. And around the city, racial violence ensued, including an unarmed black man being chased into the Royal Theater and then murdered viciously on the stage. Greenwood men fled from the courthouse because they were outnumbered and because they were pursued by this crazy mob of enraged men. Most of the black men made it back to their side of town, preparing to defend their community, their wives, their children, their property, which caused rumors to circulate again, rumors that ginned up a response that was completely out of touch with reality, and it was being said that there was a Negro uprising, and therefore get ready to protect yourself and get ready at the same time to defend your property, even though the property was not under assault. It was the property of the black citizens there. So throughout the night, they were engaged in gun battles at the Frisco tracks. Those were the tracks that separated black Greenwood from the white sections of Tulsa. Interestingly, many of the black men, and you will see some of them in some of these photographs, donned their World War I uniforms, their military uniforms, the uniforms that they had worn to protect the nation in segregated troops in our armed services. Those uniforms had hung in their closets. They put them back on to remind the mob that they were Americans, that they were patriots, that they had offered to give their lives and that so many never returned home. And I thought that was kind of fascinating, that you're being besieged, you're watching scores of your neighbors be murdered, lynched, burned, you're watching businesses being destroyed, and you still love your country so much that you go and get your uniform, your military uniform, and put it on and stand in your doorway to protect your house. On that same night, police chief, sheriff, and a judge requested that Governor J.B.A. Robinson send the National Guard in so that they would have troops to restore the order. Around this time, however, fires began to erupt in the town of Greenwood. Remember, this was called then, and it is now, the Black Wall Street of America. It was great commerce, great independence, great businesses, and great people developing a community that they could be proud of, that Oklahoma could be proud of, and that the nation could be proud of. But around this time, fires began to erupt, and firefighters were actually threatened by the white mobs as they tried to extinguish the flames. And so they could not protect all of the homes, which is why 1,000 homes burned down. And they started rounding up black civilians for them to be interred, locked up, put in jail. From 2 a.m. that morning until 5 a.m., members of the Tulsa Police Department, the Tulsa National Guard, and the American Legion formed mobs of white men into companies and made a plan to invade Greenwood at daybreak. They were going to end it once and for all, even though they had started it. And unlike the gun battles of the night before, this violence was more one-sided during this invasion as it was carried out. Despite pockets of resistance from black residents, they were overwhelmed. Women, children, and the elderly. So we have this crazy, crazy situation where this is happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and yet there is not a sound from the White House, knowing that the National Guard has been called up, knowing by this time that 200 black citizens had been murdered. There's this eerie, eerie silence. And so the mobs carried out their terrorizing campaign. They did it with the old-style early automobiles, the few that were around at the time. They did it with machine guns mounted on grain elevators. They did it as mobs with tiki torches and knives and shotguns. They were organized and began methodically burning Greenwood down, block by block, while women and children stood there watching people being set ablaze. So it's horrific. It's the sort of thing that I really don't even want to have to come here and talk about. But unless we tell the story of how we became who we are, every aspect of that story, I think we do a disservice to history. And it's something, as I've said before, that is just absolutely shameful. Dr. A.C. Jackson, who at the time was a black doctor and one of America's more prominent surgeons, a black man, was murdered, surrendering with his hands in the air on the steps of his porch. His home was then looted and burned. An elderly, paralyzed black man was gunned down when he refused an order to stand. Well, he couldn't stand. He's paralyzed. And shot down and killed. These are the reports that are still in the newspapers of the time that talked about and wrote about what was happening. A black double amputee was tied to the bumper of a car and dragged through the streets until he died and could not say anything else. And while there was resistance, including a group of black men fighting the invaders at the Mount Zion Baptist Church there in Greenwood, the resistance was ultimately scattered by overwhelming machine gun fire. So, as I've said before, this scene and scenes like this are part of the history that we have to pledge ourselves that we will never, ever revisit. And you see these persons who were the last ones that did not get murdered. And what does the headline say? Captured Negroes on the way to Convention Hall, June 1st, 1921. So what was a community of law-abiding, hardworking, successful people that caused black communities around the nation to look at Tulsa as the epitome of what could happen in terms of commerce and what could happen in terms of education and what could happen in terms of just being able to raise families the right way in America? That picture never returned to the way it was. People envied what was going on there until what they knew had happened and what we all know did happen. Again, practically every building in that black community, dozens of churches, 5 hotels, 3 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctors' offices, 24 grocery stores, a public library, and over 1,000 homes burned to the ground. As I said before, this is really not something that anybody wants to talk about or regurgitate. It's very painful, quite frankly, when you read through the books of history and you hear this. And my role here on the floor is not to make anybody feel bad or to shame anybody. I just want us to remember that this took place, to know it, and not to assume that things like this will never happen again, because, you know, if you live long enough, you might see everything twice. But to pledge ourselves as a nation that we would never, ever permit something like this to take place. Again, silence from the White House when this was happening. The governor there finally got involved on the 3rd day. Martial law was declared on June 1st. The massacre had largely ceased by then, and the fires continued to smolder and burn throughout the day. That martial law was lifted on June 3rd. The National Guard left Tulsa on June 4th. And the primary role of the National Guard during the massacre was to arbitrarily take any and all black men into custody, which prevented them from trying to fight the blazes that were burning down their own homes. Now, this may be hard to believe also, but internment camps were set up at the convention hall at McNulty Park and at the Tulsa Fairgrounds. We didn't see internment camps again until the 1950s, when Japanese ancestred Americans were huddled up and locked behind bars out of a strange and twisted paranoid fear that they somehow would forget their loyalty to their new homes and their loyalty to the country that they love. But these were the first internment camps set up in Tulsa, and armed guards were placed there to oversee the 4,000 to 6,000 people that were detained in those camps, which were reported at the time to have terrible sanitary conditions and inadequate food. And for at least a month after the massacre, African Americans needed to be sponsored by a white Tulsan in order to get a special ID card in order to leave the internment camp for 24 hours. You just really can't make this up. Without their card, and those without employment were forced to work to clean the city, to bury more bodies that had not been buried, and to live in that internment camp for almost a year. 4,000 to 6,000 people. You know, it's difficult to fully confirm the number of casualties. I've told you before, the best estimates by reporters at the time and the newspaper were that there were 300 people killed, that many of them were just thrown into mass graves, and it was difficult to count because you were not allowed out on the streets. And, you know, the reports from the Red Cross at that time documented at least 700 injuries, people who lost their eyes, lost their limbs, people who had their fingers cut off. These sights, these sounds, these horrors that I've just described bear a resemblance to an apocalyptic war zone, quite frankly. But it wasn't a war zone. It was the country that we love. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. So it was devilish destruction that took place. And I want to put up again these numbers so that for somebody just tuning in saying, oh, what is he talking about? I'm using the end of Black History Month. Again, not to sing flowery songs or to talk about great achievements within the African American community. We do that throughout the year. But to talk about a pain that continues to burn in the hearts of people that had to go through that. And to remind all of us that this really did happen. In 1921, Oklahoma impaneled a grand jury that subpoenaed 200 witnesses and returned 70 indictments. And interestingly enough, mostly against Black people in the community who were the victims of the riot and the victims of the massacre. And appallingly, the only people ever accused and the only people to go to prison were the Black people of that community. The grand jury deemed that the massacre was a riot and blamed it on Black men who went to the courthouse that night at the request of the sheriff to help protect the courthouse and to help to keep mobs from lynching the young 19-year-old kid that was there who had been falsely accused. Tulsa's Public Welfare Board was formed to handle the rebuilding. Remember, this was 1921, which was replaced by then Tulsa Mayor T.D. Evans with a, quote, reconstruction committee. In his speech announcing the committee, Mayor Evans blamed the riot again on the Black people of Greenwood and suggested that the land should be redeveloped for industrial purposes. Remember, this was Black Wall Street of the time, the envy of communities around the country, the model of self-initiative and discipline and citizenship. But the mayor said it ought to be redeveloped for industrial purposes. So seated on the committee that granted his wish were individuals that included the likes of Tate Brady, who was a wealthy white landowner who was also later identified in several reports as a leading Klansman. The city tried to enforce or force survivors out of Greenwood by passing also a new fire ordinance that made rebuilding extremely expensive, even though your house had been burned down. You should think the government would try to help you. They made it more expensive, since so many homes of the 1,000 that burned never got rebuilt. A year later, in September of 1921, an African-American attorney named Buck Colbert Franklin secured a permanent injunction against that ordinance, even though many had already been arrested for simply trying to rebuild their homes. The FBI got involved, and a gentleman by the name of T.F. Weiss, a special agent, was leading up this effort. The FBI's predecessor agency was also sent at that time to investigate whether crimes had taken place during the riot. Whether crimes had taken place? We have a complete onslaught of violence that carries over for 3 days, where 300 people are murdered living in the community that they helped to build, where all of their businesses are burned to the ground, where 1,000 homes are totally destroyed, where the cost and the estimate was more than the state of Oklahoma even wanted to think about. And yet, in Agent Weiss's own report, he makes mention that on the night of May 31st, a police officer had recruited men from nearby towns to join in the raid that would take place the next morning, which should have been evidence itself of pre-planning, but the report was never turned in. Agent Weiss took less than a week to complete his interviews and write a report, which may have never been reviewed by an individual at the Justice Department. In the halls of our judicial systems, victims and descendants desperately continued to seek some form of redress, and they were all met with similar blockades. 4 years later, in September of 1926, the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled that insurance companies could not be sued from the damages that took place as a result of the massacre. So you can pay your insurance year after you've built your own house and lived there with your family, and somebody burns it down, and you go to whatever the insurance company was at the day, and to try to seek some relief, the Supreme Court in Oklahoma ruled that those insurance companies didn't have to do a damn thing, nothing. Residents tried to sue Mayor Evans, they tried to sue the Tulsa police, and others throughout the decade of the 1920s. All of those lawsuits, all of them were dismissed. And so in 2003, survivors and descendants of Tulsa, alleging civil rights violations and a denial of equal protection in the case Alexander versus Oklahoma, that began a process that gets us closer to where we are today. And there were descendants. In fact, there are two women who both, I believe, are 105 or 106 years of age, who fought this, never stopped trying to give up. They were the last group of survivors. They brought their case all the way to the Supreme Court. These are the witnesses that saw 300 people murdered, 1,000 homes destroyed, 85 businesses destroyed. And they held on some sort of way because they believed, as they said, they have to tell the story before they died because no one else wanted to tell the story. It's unbelievable. And so in June of last year, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed the case, finding that the plaintiffs did not have legitimate grievances, or that their grievances did not fall within the scope of the law that they sought to utilize. Just absolutely amazing. And I don't know what it would have been like holding on all those many years with a nightmare of a story in your gut and in your belly, with the crying and the pain and the violence that you witnessed as a young person, but they held on. They held on. In 2010, just as a decade before the Supreme Court of Tulsa, Oklahoma's decision, the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation was opened in Tulsa. That center was established to foster dialogue about historical and racial violence and the lingering effects that it has on people. And how do you find that pain and promote healing? And that's why this story is so interesting. Mrs. Viola Ford Fletcher and Ms. Leslie Benningfield Randall never stopped believing that their country would in fact correct a wrong that had gone on so long. And God only knows when they leave this country for this planet for their eternal rest, that we have to carry on with their belief also, that there will be a reckoning, that there will be reconciliation, and that there will be a need to tell the story, not to make anybody feel bad, but to make everybody more committed to the fact that we have to be one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty for all. I've got some documents that were sent over. Eric, give me those, would you? I don't want to belabor the point, and so I won't. I can just tell you that I've lived long enough to know that difficulties between groups in our society are not novel, nor are they new, but that our approach to those differences must be both. For more than 200 years, we have joined together different colors, different creeds, different nationalities, all under that one flag. And while this assembled diversity has produced the most successful experience of democracy in the world's history, we have by no means clearly achieved perfect harmony. Slavery was allowed to exist legally for almost 200 years. Crosses were burned to terrorize black people in an ugly desecration of the symbol of love. Just a century ago, Protestants and Catholics battled in the streets of New York City, and on that day, 44 Catholics were killed. At the end of the decade of the 1930s, a ship by the name of the St. Louis, with a human cargo of Jewish men and Jewish women, was denied safe harbor in this, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and sent back to a madman named Hitler. At the beginning of World War II, as I mentioned earlier, Japanese Americans were huddled up and placed behind bars and in internment camps out of a fear that they somehow would forget their loyalty to their new home. After the attacks of 9/11, Arab and Muslim Americans were set upon and beaten in the streets of America, lest we ever forget, by angry men who formed mobs of their own. Because their religion and because their ethnicity were deemed to be a threat to the land that they professed to love. And so there have been times when we have sought as a nation to ban the teaching of a foreign language and to slam shut the doors of elementary schools simply because they were sponsored by religious groups. And so there have been occasions and there have been periods where our differences of race, our differences of religion, our differences of nationality have produced an ugly alienation instead of producing harmony. But as I prepare to conclude this portion of my remarks, let me remind all of us that there is still yet another difference. The difference between the people who have and the people who have not. The difference between the people in this room, members of the United States Congress, you and I, and the millions of people in this country who at this hour are out of work or working at jobs that provide them with a scant living and no real dignity. The difference between us, you and I, on one hand, living as we do in relative comfort, and the millions of people in the streets across America torn by the terrible pain of drug addiction. The difference between us and the illiterates. The difference between us and the homeless. The difference between our children, parents, and the 15-year-olds in towns and communities across this nation who at this hour are about to have children of their own, creating a situation where they are lost, unprepared, and doomed to raising another generation of disadvantaged children. Those differences produce frustration. They produce anger. America at her best has always treated those differences with a blend of common sense and compassion. America at her worst has treated such differences with the empty even-handedness of Marie Antoinette. You know, just let them eat cake. We can't be bothered. And yet we know that this is not a perfect nation. And we are not perfect people. But God calls all of us to a perfect mission. It is still whether we are Christian, Jew, Muslim, or something else. It is still a mission to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, teach the illiterate, provide guidance to our young, and security to our seniors. And a part of that guidance means remembering the stony road that we trod to get to where we are here in 2025. By remembering something as painful even as this Tulsa Race Massacre, which I've tried to talk about now over and over again. And in remembering, committing ourselves and promising those who have gone before us and those who will come after us that we will never allow something like that to happen again. I've not given up on the American dream or the American possibility. And I have come to the floor tonight to ask people around this country not to give up also. I'm convinced that this nation still stands before the world as perhaps the last expression of a possibility of mankind devising a social order where justice is the supreme ruler and law is but its instrument, where freedom is the dominant creed and order but its principle, where equity is the common practice and fraternity the true human condition. And it is also my conviction that we may be the last generation of Americans that has the opportunity to help our nation totally fulfill that promise and to realize that still yet to achieve possibility. So, Mr. Speaker, I again call our attention to the matter of the Tulsa Race Massacre. As we conclude Black History Month tomorrow, but this could be December, it doesn't matter. It's something we've got to not hide in books and say those books are banned and tell a generation of young people, you can't read this, you don't need to know that. Again, we have to use it in an instructive way to talk about how far we have come since then and why we must do more and why something like that can't take place again. So I am going to talk a bit, just briefly, about this whole situation that we're facing, regrettably, with people being laid off and fired and being asked, what'd you do last week? But I do want to make sure that my colleague, the distinguished gentleman from Alabama, has an opportunity to come forward and to take as much time as he deems necessary to make another very important point. And so I would yield to Representative Figures as much time as he may consume.